The Kremlin's what happened on June 10 and why it matters more than you think.
Let me take you back to June 10, 2024, a date that, at first glance, might seem like just another routine diplomatic exchange in the grinding stalemate of the Ukraine war. That was the day the Kremlin issued what it called its unyielding conditions for any potential ceasefire or negotiation with Kyiv and its Western backers. The language was characteristically blunt: almost no Ukrainian membership in NATO, recognition of Russia's territorial gains, and a formal end to what Moscow calls the denazification process.
Predictably, the Western response was swift and scornful.
White House officials called the demands unrealistic, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg labeled them blackmail, and the usual chorus of pundits dismissed them as yet another example of Putin's intransigence. But here's the thing: this wasn't just another round of diplomatic posturing.
What unfolded that day was far more significant, and far more dangerous, than the headlines suggested.
As someone who has spent the better part of 3 decades studying Russian strategy, from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the current war in Ukraine, I can tell you the Kremlin's conditions weren't just a negotiating position. They were a declaration, a line in the sand that reveals how Moscow sees the endgame of this conflict, and how far it's willing to go to secure it. And if you think this is just about Ukraine, you're missing the bigger picture.
Because what we're witnessing isn't just a war over territory.
It's a clash of two fundamentally incompatible visions of the world order, one where the United States remains the undisputed hegemon, and another where a multipolar system emerges, with Russia, China, and others carving out their own spheres of influence.
The Kremlin's demands weren't just about Ukraine.
They were about the future of global power.
Now, let me be I'm not here to defend Putin's actions. What Russia has done in Ukraine is indefensible by any moral standard.
But if we're going to navigate this crisis without stumbling into a wider war, or worse, a nuclear confrontation, we need to understand what's really driving Moscow's strategy.
And that starts by looking beyond the official narrative. The official what they want you to believe. So, what is the official story?
According to the Biden administration, NATO, and most Western media outlets, the Kremlin's conditions are nothing more than a cynical ploy, a transparent attempt to lock in Russia's illegal gains while buying time to regroup for another offensive. The White House has been particularly vocal, framing the demands as proof that Putin has no interest in genuine diplomacy. Russia is not serious about negotiations, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said in a press briefing shortly after the conditions were released. They're trying to dictate terms at the barrel of a gun.
The media has largely echoed this line.
The New York Times ran a piece titled "Putin's a bid to freeze the war on his terms," while The Guardian described the conditions as a non-starter for the West. Even the more hawkish outlets, like the Wall Street Journal, framed the demands as evidence that Russia is digging in for a long war, with no intention of backing down.
And the data seems to support this interpretation.
Since the start of the war, Russia has occupied roughly 18% of Ukraine's pre-2014 territory, including Crimea, Donbass, and large swaths of the south and east.
Moscow has also made it clear that it views these gains as non-negotiable. In September 2022, Putin formally annexed 4 Ukrainian regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, after staging sham referendums. The West, of course, rejected these annexations as illegal, but the message was Russia is not giving these territories back. So, on the surface, the narrative makes sense. Putin is a dictator who launched an unprovoked war, seized territory, and is now trying to force the West to accept his conquests. Case closed, right? But there's a problem with this narrative. It's incomplete.
And in geopolitics, incomplete narratives are dangerous because they lead to incomplete solutions, and in this case, incomplete solutions could get us all killed.
Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the most obvious: why now? Why did the Kremlin choose June 10 to lay out these conditions? The timing wasn't random.
Just days earlier, Ukraine had launched its much-anticipated counteroffensive in the south, with initial reports suggesting heavy losses for Russian forces. At the same time, Western military aid, particularly the long-delayed F-16s, was finally starting to arrive in Ukraine.
So, was Moscow's move a sign of weakness? A desperate attempt to freeze the conflict before Ukraine could make further gains? Not quite. Here's what the mainstream narrative: the Kremlin's conditions weren't just about the battlefield. They were about the diplomatic battlefield.
And if you look closely, you'll see that Russia has been laying the groundwork for this moment for months. Back in March, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Moscow, where he and Putin signed a joint statement declaring that friendship between the two states has no limits. More importantly, China released its own 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, which, while vague, called for an immediate ceasefire and the start of negotiations. The West dismissed the plan as a non-starter, but here's the key: Russia didn't. In fact, Moscow welcomed it, with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov calling it a step in the right direction. Then, in April, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, hardly a Putin ally, proposed a peace club of neutral countries to mediate the conflict.
Again, the West ignored it.
But Russia didn't. And in May, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa led an African delegation to Kiev and Moscow, where they presented another peace proposal. Once more, the West was skeptical, but Russia engaged.
So, what's really going on here? Why is Russia suddenly so interested in peace plans, especially when it's winning on the ground?
The answer lies in something I've been warning about: for Russia is playing the long game.
And the long game isn't just about Ukraine. It's about reshaping the global order.
Let me tell you something that most Western analysts won't: Russia doesn't actually want a frozen conflict. What it wants is a negotiated settlement, one that locks in its gains, ends Western military support for Ukraine, and, most importantly, forces the United States to accept a new reality in Europe. A reality where NATO's eastward action is halted, where Ukraine is neutralized, and where Russia is recognized as a great power with its own sphere of influence.
Now, you might be, that's absurd. The West would never accept that. And you'd be right if the West were united. But here's the it's not. And Russia knows it. Take a look at the data.
A Pew Research poll from May 2024 found that 42% of Americans now believe the US is providing too much support to Ukraine, a number that's been steadily rising. In Europe, the picture is even more fractured.
Hungary, Slovakia, and even Germany have seen growing public opposition to continued aid.
And in the global south, countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa have refused to condemn Russia, instead calling for negotiations.
This is the hidden reality: that the official narrative, Russia is winning the diplomatic war.
And it's doing so by exploiting the one weakness the West can't fix: its own divisions. But here's where it gets even more interesting.
Because the Kremlin's conditions weren't just about Ukraine. They were about China.
The extant geopolitical, the real stakes of this war. If you want to understand why Russia is so confident in its demands, you need to
way out. Because this isn't just a war between Russia and Ukraine.
It's a proxy conflict in a much larger struggle, the struggle for the future of the international order.
Let me put this in terms that might make some people: the United States is in decline.
Not in the sense that it's about to collapse, far from it.
But in the sense that its ability to unilaterally shape global events is eroding. And the two biggest challenges to American hegemony? Russia and China. Now, I know what your Russia is: a declining power. Its economy is smaller than Italy's. Its military is bogged down in Ukraine. How can it possibly challenge the US? And on the surface, that's true.
But here's the thing about great power: it's not just about raw power.
It's about leverage. And right now, Russia has more leverage than most people realize. First, let's talk about China. The Sino-Russian relationship is often described as a marriage of convenience, but that undersells it.
This is a strategic partnership with real substance. In 2023, bilateral trade between the two countries hit a record $240 billion, with China now accounting for nearly 40% of Russia's total trade. More importantly, China has become Russia's lifeline in the face of Western sanctions. Chinese banks have stepped in to facilitate trade, Chinese tech firms have replaced Western ones, and Chinese energy companies are investing heavily in Russian oil and gas.
But the real game changer? Military cooperation. In April 2024, reports emerged that China was providing Russia with satellite intelligence, drone technology, and even artillery shells, though Beijing denies it. And while China hasn't sent lethal aid, the mere fact that it's providing any support is a massive strategic win for Moscow. Because it means that Russia isn't isolated.
It has a powerful backer, one that shares its vision of a multipolar world.
And that's the key. Because what Russia and China want isn't just to win in Ukraine. It's to break the US-led order.
They want a world where NATO doesn't exist, where the dollar isn't the global reserve currency, and where the United States can't dictate terms to other countries.
And they're using Ukraine as the first major test of that vision. Now, let's talk about the United States. Because here's the uncomfortable: America's strategy in Ukraine is failing. Not because we're losing on the battlefield, Ukraine is still holding its own, but because we're losing the strategic war. Let me explain.
The US has two primary goals in Ukraine. The first is to weaken Russia to the point where it can't threaten NATO.
The second is to demonstrate to China that any aggression against Taiwan would be met with a similar response.
But here's the: neither of those goals is being achieved. On the first goal, Russia is not being weakened.
In fact, it's stronger than it was before the war.
Its economy has adapted to sanctions, its military has learned from its mistakes, and its defense industry is now producing more artillery shells than the US and Europe combined.
And while Ukraine has performed heroically, it's running out of manpower, and Western aid is drying up. On the second goal, the message to China is not that aggression doesn't pay. It's that the West is divided. China sees that the US can't sustain long-term support for Ukraine, that Europe is fracturing, and that the global South is refusing to pick sides. And that's emboldening Beijing.
Just look at the recent military drills around Taiwan. China is testing the waters, seeing how far it can push before the US pushes back.
So, what's the endgame here?
If Russia can't be defeated militarily, and if the West can't sustain its support for Ukraine indefinitely, then the only way this war ends is through negotiation.
And that's exactly what the Kremlin's conditions are designed to achieve. But here's the West isn't ready to negotiate. And that's where the real danger lies.
Military and strategic: the illusion of a quick victory.
Now, let's talk about the military side of this.
Because if there's one thing that keeps me up at night, it's the sheer naivety of some of the hawks in Washington and Brussels. I've lost count of how many times I've heard some armchair general on cable news say, "We just need to give Ukraine more weapons, and they'll push Russia out." Or, "If we just send F-16s, the war will be over in months."
Or, my personal favorite, "Putin is weak.
One more push, and he'll collapse."
Let me tell you, war doesn't work like that.
And if you think it does, you haven't studied history.
Take Afghanistan.
In 2001, the US invaded with overwhelming force, toppled the Taliban in weeks, and declared victory.
20 years later, we left in defeat. Or Iraq. In 2003, we rolled into Baghdad in 3 weeks.
18 years later, we left with nothing to show for it but a broken country and thousands of dead soldiers.
Now, I'm not saying Ukraine is doomed. Far from it.
But I am saying that the idea that this war can be won with a few more weapons or a little more time is dangerously misguided.
Because Russia isn't Iraq or Afghanistan.
It's a nuclear-armed great power with a population of 140 million, a massive defense industry, and a leader who has shown he's willing to escalate, including with tactical nukes, if he feels cornered.
Let's look at the numbers.
Since the start of the war, Russia has lost an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured.
That's a staggering number.
But here's the: Russia can afford it. It has a population of 140 million, and it's been mobilizing reservists and recruiting prisoners to fill the gaps. Ukraine, on the other hand, has a population of just 40 million, and it's running out of men. In December 2023, Zelensky admitted that Ukraine was losing 10,000 soldiers a month.
That's unsustainable. And then there's the economic side.
The US has sent over $100 billion in military and economic aid to Ukraine.
Europe has sent another $50 billion. But for how long?
The US is facing a debt crisis, with interest payments on the national debt now exceeding defense spending. Europe is dealing with its own economic woes, including energy shortages and rising populism.
And the global South? They're not sending a dime. So, what happens when the money runs out? What happens when Ukraine can't replace its losses? What happens when Russia, with its larger population and industrial base, starts to gain the upper hand? That's the scenario no one in Washington wants to talk about. Because the truth is, time is not on Ukraine's side. And the longer this war drags on, the worse the outcome will be for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the world. But here's the really scary: Russia knows this. And that's why it's playing the long game. It knows that the West's resolve will crack before its own does. And that's why it's issuing these unyielding conditions now, because it knows that, eventually, the West will have to come to the table. And when it does, Russia wants to dictate the terms. The domestic political why Washington can't walk away. Now, let's talk about something that's often overlooked in these domestic politics. Because if you want to understand why the US is so committed to Ukraine, despite the mounting costs and diminishing returns, you need to look at what's happening in Washington. Let's start with the elections. The 2024 US presidential election is shaping up to be one of the most consequential in decades. And Ukraine is a major issue. On the Republican side, Donald Trump has made it clear that he wants to end US support for Ukraine, calling the war a European problem and accusing Biden of dragging us into World War III. On the Democratic side, Biden has staked his presidency on Ukraine, framing it as a battle between democracy and autocracy. But here's the: neither side is being honest with the American people. Because the truth is, this war isn't just about democracy versus autocracy. It's about great power competition. And if the US walks away from Ukraine, it sends a message to the America is weak. That's a message Biden can't afford to send, especially not in an election year. Because if he does, it's not just his legacy that's at stake. It's the entire post-Cold War order. But it's not just about Biden. It's about the foreign policy establishment. The people who run the State Department, the Pentagon, and the intelligence agencies. They've spent the last 30 years building a world where the US is the undisputed leader. And they're not about to let Russia or China rewrite the rules. Take Victoria Nuland, the former Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs. She's one of the architects of US policy in Ukraine, and she's made it clear that she sees this war as a fight for the future of Europe. In a 2023 speech, she said, "If we let Putin win in Ukraine, it won't stop there. He'll keep going: Moldova, the Baltics, Poland. And then what? Do we really want to fight a war with Russia over Warsaw?" Now, I'm not saying Nuland is wrong. But I am saying that this kind of thinking is dangerous. Because it assumes that the US can afford to keep fighting these wars. And the data doesn't support that. Let's look at the numbers. In 2023, the US spent $877 billion on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined. And yet, we're still struggling to keep up with China's military buildup. The Pentagon's own reports warn that China could invade Taiwan by 2027. And if that happens, the US will be forced to: do we defend Taiwan, or do we defend Ukraine? That's a choice no president wants to make. But it's one we might have to make unless we change course. And that's the real problem. Because right now, the domestic political incentives in Washington are all pushing toward escalation. No one wants to be the president. Who blinked first in the standoff over Ukraine funding? The reality is that the American public is exhausted by forever wars, and the political class knows it. But instead of admitting that the strategy isn't working, they double down. It's the same playbook we saw in Afghanistan, just with different actors and a different battlefield. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the broader shift in global power dynamics. The US has spent the last 3 decades acting as the world's policeman, and now, for the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's facing a peer competitor in China and a revanchist Russia that refuses to accept American hegemony. The problem is that Washington still thinks it can have it both ways: contain China in the Pacific while simultaneously fighting a proxy war in Europe. That's a fantasy. Let me explain why this matters. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy made it China is the pacing threat, and Russia is an acute but secondary challenge. Yet here we are, 2 years later, with the US pouring more resources into Ukraine than it is into modernizing its own military for a potential conflict with China. The numbers don't lie. In fiscal year 2024,
the US allocated $61 billion in supplemental funding for Ukraine, more than the entire annual defense budget of Germany. Meanwhile, the Navy's shipbuilding plan is in shambles, the Air Force is retiring more aircraft than it's buying, and the Army is struggling to recruit.
This isn't just mismanagement, it's strategic malpractice. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is fighting the last war while China is preparing for the next one. Beijing isn't just watching what's happening in Ukraine, it's learning.
Every time the US sends another batch of HIMARS or ATACMS to Kiev, China takes notes on how Washington responds to escalation. Every time the West imposes sanctions on Russia, Beijing studies how to insulate itself from similar measures. And every time the US stretches its military commitments thin, China sees an opportunity to accelerate its own plans, whether that's in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, or beyond. Take Taiwan, for example. The Pentagon's 2023 China Military Power Report estimated that Beijing now has the largest navy in the world, with over 370 ships and submarines.
By 2030, that number is expected to grow to 435.
Meanwhile, the US Navy is projected to have just 290 ships by the same year.
That's not a gap, it's a chasm.
And yet, instead of focusing on closing that gap, we're still debating whether to send another $60 billion to Ukraine. It's like a boxer who keeps throwing punches at one opponent while ignoring the heavyweight champion circling the ring.
Now, I'm not saying Ukraine doesn't matter. It does. But we have to be honest about the trade-offs. The US can't afford to treat every conflict as an existential struggle.
That's how empires overextend themselves, and that's how they fall.
The Romans didn't lose their empire because they lacked courage, they lost it because they couldn't prioritize.
The British didn't lose their empire because they were weak, they lost it because they tried to hold on to too much for too long.
And if we're not careful, the US will follow the same path. Let's talk about the military implications for a moment. The war in Ukraine has been a wake-up call for NATO.
For years, European allies have underinvested in their own defense, relying on the US to pick up the slack. But now, with Russia on the march, they're scrambling to rebuild their militaries. Germany, for the first time since the Cold War, has committed to spending 2% of its GDP on defense.
Poland is on track to have the largest army in Europe by 2030. Even France is increasing its defense budget. This is a good thing, if it lasts. The problem is that Europe's military revival is still in its infancy, and it's happening at a time when the US is increasingly distracted by its own domestic divisions and the looming threat from China. Here's where things get really interesting. The Kremlin's unyielding conditions aren't just about Ukraine, they're about testing the resolve of the entire Western alliance. Putin knows that if he can outlast the US in Ukraine, he can fracture NATO. He's betting that Europe won't have the stomach for a long war without American leadership. And he's not wrong to think that.
The political winds in Europe are shifting. In France, Marine Le Pen's national rally is gaining ground on a platform of reducing support for Ukraine. In Germany, the far-right Alternative for Germany is polling at record highs, and even the center-right Christian Democrats are questioning the wisdom of endless arms shipments.
In Italy, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has already signaled that she wants to dial back Italy's involvement in the war. This is the real danger of the current strategy. The US is betting that it can keep the West united behind Ukraine indefinitely. But that bet assumes that European publics will tolerate high energy prices, economic stagnation, and the threat of Russian retaliation forever. They won't. And when the cracks start to show, Putin will pounce. He's already laying the groundwork. Just look at the recent cyber attacks on European infrastructure, the sabotage of undersea pipelines, and the Kremlin's efforts to meddle in European elections. This isn't just about Ukraine, it's about undermining the entire Western order. So where does that leave us? The US has a choice to make. It can continue down the current path, pouring billions into a war that may not be winnable, while China builds its military and Europe fractures. Or it can recalibrate its strategy, prioritize deterrence in the Pacific, push Europe to take more responsibility for its own defense, and seek a negotiated settlement in Ukraine before the conflict spirals out of control. The problem is that neither option is politically palatable in Washington. The foreign policy establishment is too invested in the idea of American primacy to admit that the world has changed.
The defense industry is too profitable to allow for a shift in priorities.
And the political class is too afraid of being labeled weak to consider diplomacy.
That's why we're stuck in this cycle of escalation where every concession is seen as surrender, and every negotiation is framed as appeasement.
But here's the real leadership isn't about never backing down. It's about knowing when to fight and when to talk.
It's about understanding that strength isn't measured by how many wars you're willing to start, but by how many you can avoid.
And right now, the US is failing that test.
We're so focused on proving that we're still the world's policeman that we're forgetting what it takes to be a great power in the 21st century.
And that's a mistake we may not be able to afford. Now, what most people don't realize is that this paralysis in Washington isn't just about foreign policy, it's a symptom of a deeper domestic crisis, one that's been building for decades. The American political system, for all its strengths, was never designed to handle prolonged, low-intensity conflicts where the costs are diffuse and the benefits are abstract. We saw this in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan.
The public tunes out, the media moves on, and the war grinds on until someone in power finally admits that the emperor has no clothes. The difference this time is that the stakes are higher, the adversaries are more capable, and the margin for error is razor-thin.
Let me explain why this matters for the average American. Right now, the war in Ukraine is being sold as a moral crusade, a battle between democracy and autocracy, freedom and tyranny. And in many ways, it is. But moral clarity doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't put food on the table or gas in the tank. And when the economic pain starts to bite, that moral clarity gets a lot fuzzier. We're already seeing the early signs of this. Inflation may have cooled from its peak, but real wages are still stagnant, and the cost of living is eating into household budgets. The average American family is spending $700 more per month than they were 3 years ago just to maintain the same standard of living. That's not sustainable.
And when the next recession hits, and it will, public patience for endless war funding is going to evaporate.
Here's the uncomfortable: the American people are not as invested in this conflict as the political class thinks they are. Polling shows that support for Ukraine aid is broad but shallow.
A Pew Research survey from last month found that while 62% of Americans still support sending weapons to Ukraine, that number drops to 48% when asked if the US is doing too much.
And among Republicans, that number plummets to 31%.
That's not a stable foundation for a long-term strategy. It's a house of cards waiting for a gust of wind.
And that gust is coming. The 2024 election is shaping up to be a referendum on exactly this issue.
Donald Trump, for all his flaws, has tapped into a very real frustration with the status quo. His message, America first, end the endless wars, focus on our own problems, resonates because it speaks to the exhaustion of a country that's been at war for over 2 decades. Now, I'm not saying Trump has the answers.
Far from it.
His foreign policy instincts are erratic at best, and his transactional approach to alliances could do real damage. But what he does have is a finger on the pulse of a significant portion of the electorate that feels ignored by the establishment. And that's a problem for the Biden administration, because it means that even if they win in November, they're going to be governing a country that's deeply divided on this issue.
Now, let's talk about the other side of the Russia. Putin's domestic position is far more stable than most Western analysts would like to admit.
The Russian economy has weathered the sanctions storm better than expected, thanks in part to high energy prices and a pivot to Asia. The ruble is stable, unemployment is low, and while living standards have taken a hit, the Kremlin has managed to insulate the urban middle class from the worst effects. More importantly, Putin has framed this war as an existential struggle not just for Ukraine, but for Russia itself. He's betting that the Russian people will tolerate hardship if they believe the alternative is national humiliation.
And so far, that bet is paying off.
The recent partial mobilization was a political gamble, but it didn't spark the mass protests that many in the West predicted.
Why? Because Putin has spent the last 2 decades systematically dismantling the institutions that could challenge his rule. The opposition is either in jail, in exile, or dead. The media is state-controlled. The security services are loyal.
And the Russian people, for all their grumbling, have shown a remarkable capacity for endurance.
This doesn't mean Putin is invincible. Far from it.
But it does mean that he's not going to be toppled by economic pressure or popular unrest, not in the short term, anyway.
So where does that leave us? If I had to sketch out a few plausible scenarios for the next 12 to 18 months, here's what I'd watch for. First, the status quo.
The US and Europe continue to arm Ukraine, Russia digs in, and the war grinds on. This is the most likely outcome in the short term, but it's also the most dangerous. The longer this goes on, the greater the risk of miscalculation, whether it's a Russian strike on NATO supply lines, a Ukrainian counteroffensive that goes horribly wrong, or a cyber attack that spirals out of control.
And the longer it goes on, the more likely it is that public support in the West will erode.
We saw this in Afghanistan, where the US spent 20 years and $2 trillion only to leave in chaos. The difference here is that the enemy is stronger, the stakes are higher, and the exit ramp is narrower.
Second, a negotiated settlement.
This is the outcome that the establishment in Washington and Brussels will resist with every fiber of their being, because it requires admitting that neither side can win. But it's also the most rational outcome. The outlines of a deal are already a frozen conflict, with Ukraine getting security guarantees but not NATO membership, and Russia keeping Crimea and parts of the Donbass.
The problem is that neither side is ready to blink.
Zelensky can't afford to be seen as surrendering territory, and Putin can't afford to be seen as losing. But if the alternative is years of bloody stalemate, at some point, someone is going to have to make a deal. The question is whether it happens before or after a catastrophic escalation.
Third, a collapse of Western unity. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. The cracks are already showing. Hungary is blocking EU aid packages. Slovakia has elected a pro-Russian government. France and Germany are at odds over how much support to provide.
And in the US, Trump is already signaling that he'll cut off Ukraine if he wins in November. If the West fractures, Putin wins by default.
He doesn't need to defeat Ukraine on the battlefield, he just needs to outlast the West's political will. And right now, he's doing exactly that. Here's the bottom: the war in Ukraine is not just a conflict between two countries. It's a stress test for the entire international order. And right now, that order is failing.
The US is overstretched, Europe is divided, and Russia is playing the long game. The question is whether the West can adapt before it's too late.
And I'm not optimistic. Because here's the thing about great: they don't decline because of a single defeat.
They decline because they refuse to acknowledge that the world has changed. The British Empire didn't fall because of one bad battle. It fell because it kept trying to play by 19th century rules in a 20th century world.
The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of one bad leader. It collapsed because it refused to reform until it was too late. And the United States? Well, we're still in denial. We're still acting like we're the sole superpower, like our alliances are unbreakable, like our economy is invincible. But the truth is, we're not. And the longer we pretend otherwise, the worse it's going to get. So what's the solution? I don't have all the answers.
But I know we need to start having an honest conversation about our priorities.
Do we want to be the world's policeman, or do we want to be a great power that can actually solve its own problems? Do we want to keep pouring money into a war that may not be winnable, or do we want to invest in our own infrastructure, our own people, our own future? These aren't easy questions. But they're the ones we need to be asking. Because if we don't, someone else will answer them for us. And I guarantee you, we're not going to like their answers.